They say a man's life can change in the space between one heartbeat and the next, but Elias Whitaker learned it could change even faster when 500 riders appear at your gate before the morning coffee cools. The sun had barely climbed above the low hills when the dust began to rise along the northern ridge, a thin brown ribbon stretching across the pale Wyoming sky, and Elias stood on the porch of his weathered farmhouse with one hand resting on the rail, squinting through 67 years of wind and sunlight, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him again. For 12 quiet years the old farmer had lived on that lonely patch of land outside Frontier Creek, tending 40 acres of stubborn soil, mending fences, feeding his 2 tired horses, and speaking to no one but the wind that rolled down from the high plains every evening like an old companion that never asked questions. Folks in town said Elias Whitaker was a man who'd already buried everything worth loving, and maybe that was true, because the man who once laughed easy and rode hard had disappeared somewhere between a war that took his son and a winter that took his wife, leaving behind only a quiet farmer with rough hands and a habit of staring too long at the horizon. The night before had been colder than most for early October, the kind of dry prairie chill that crept through the cracks of a wooden barn and settled deep into a man's bones. And Elias had just finished checking the lanterns when he heard it. A faint sound carried through the wind, something between a whisper and a groan drifting from beyond the fence line. At first he thought it was one of the calves wandering too far from the pasture, but the sound came again, thinner this time, and Elias stepped out into the moonlit yard with his old coat pulled tight across his chest, boots crunching softly over frozen dirt as he followed the sound toward the far gate. The prairie stretched silent around him, silver under the moon, the fence posts leaning like tired soldiers in the wind, and then he saw it. A small shape slumped against the cedar rail, barely moving. It was a boy, no older than 10, with dark hair tangled across his forehead and a torn shirt streaked with dust, his breathing shallow, one arm pressed carefully against his side, as though the slightest movement might bring a wave of pain he didn't have strength left to face. Elias stopped where he stood, the wind tugging at his coat while an old voice from town echoed somewhere in his memory, the kind of warning every frontier man had heard 100 times. Leave Apache trouble where you find it. But the boy lifted his head just enough for the moonlight to catch his face, and the fear in those young eyes didn't look like trouble to Elias Whitaker. It looked like someone who had run out of road. The old farmer let out a slow breath, rubbed the back of his neck, and muttered something under his breath about how peace never lasts long out here anyway. Then he stepped forward, lifted the boy carefully in his arms, and carried him through the creaking gate toward the farmhouse where a small fire still glowed inside the stove. Elias didn't know the boy's name yet, didn't know why a wounded Apache child had collapsed at his fence in the middle of the Wyoming plains, and he certainly didn't know that somewhere beyond those distant ridges, hundreds of riders had already begun moving through the night, following a trail that led straight to the quiet farm of an old man who had simply decided that leaving a child in the cold was something he could not do. The fire inside Elias Whitaker's farmhouse burned low and steady through the night, throwing a warm amber glow across the rough wooden walls that had not heard a second heartbeat in more than a decade. The boy slept on the narrow bed near the stove, wrapped in an old wool blanket that had once belonged to Elias's son, the fabric worn soft from years of winters that no longer seemed so distant. Elias sat in the chair beside the bed with his elbows resting on his knees, studying the child the way a farmer studies the sky before a storm, quiet and careful, trying to read signs that might explain how fate had carried this small stranger across miles of prairie to collapse against his fence. The boy had spoken only once since Elias brought him inside, a single word that slipped from his lips sometime after midnight while the wind rattled the shutters outside. Taza. Elias repeated the name softly to himself now, testing the sound like a tool he had not used in years, wondering if it meant something more than a name, because names had weighed out here on the frontier, and the wrong one could carry trouble across half the territory. He had cleaned the dust from the boy's face with warm water, changed the torn shirt for one of his own old cottonwork shirts, and given him a small cup of broth that the boy drank slowly before sleep pulled him under again. The old farmer moved carefully around the room, tending the stove, placing a kettle near the fire, and checking the boy's breathing every few minutes as if the simple rhythm of breath was a fragile promise the night might still try to steal away. Outside the farmhouse, the prairie stretched wide and silent under the fading stars. The same land Elias had worked alone for 12 long seasons, planting corn in stubborn soil that cracked under summer heat, and mending fences every spring when the winter winds tore them loose again. Frontier Creek lay 12 miles down the dusty road, a town built from rough timber and suspicion, where men talked loud in the saloon and always kept one eye on the hills. People there believed the land was divided between those who belonged and those who did not, and most of them would say an Apache boy sleeping in a white farmer's house was the kind of trouble that ended in fire and shouting before the sun reached noon. Elias Whitaker knew those voices well because he had heard them many times leaning against the railing outside Miller's General Store, men shaking their heads and saying that peace was just another word for waiting until the next conflict arrived. But Elias had lived long enough to know something else, something quieter, something the town had forgotten. Sometimes a man helps someone not because it is safe, not because it is wise, but because leaving them behind would make the silence afterward too heavy to carry. The boy stirred slightly in his sleep, his brow tightening for a moment before the tension eased again, and Elias reached over to adjust the blanket with the same careful hands that once guided a plow across 40 acres of stubborn Wyoming earth. Dawn began to creep slowly through the frost on the window glass, turning the eastern sky pale gold while the kettle on the stove started to whisper with steam. The new day arrived the same way every day did on the plains, quiet and steady, and for a few calm minutes Elias believed the night had passed without consequence. He stepped out onto the porch to breathe the cool morning air, rubbing his tired eyes as the first sunlight touched the distant ridge. That was when he noticed the dust. At first it looked like nothing more than a faint shadow stretching across the horizon, the kind a cattle herd might raise miles away, but it did not move like cattle, and it did not fade with the wind. Instead it grew wider, rising slowly against the sky like a distant storm forming where the hills met the open prairie, and Elias Whitaker felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest as he realized that the quiet life he had built on this lonely farm might have just reached its final morning of peace. The dust on the horizon continued to rise slowly, spreading wider across the pale morning sky until Elias Whitaker no longer needed to squint to see that it was not a storm and it was not cattle. It moved with a rhythm the old farmer recognized from years of watching the frontier, a steady rolling cloud that came only from many horses traveling together across dry ground. Elias rested both hands on the porch rail and stared for a long moment without speaking, the way a man does when he already understands what he is looking at, but hopes the truth might still change if he waits long enough. The prairie wind carried the faint tremor of distant hooves across the fields, so light at first it almost blended with the rustle of dry grass. Yet the sound grew clearer with each passing minute until it hummed through the quiet land like a drumbeat rising from the earth itself. Elias stepped down from the porch and walked a few paces into the yard, boots pressing into the cold dirt while the sun climbed slowly behind him, throwing a long shadow that stretched across the fence line where he had found the boy the night before. He had seen riders before, traders crossing the plains, cattlemen driving herds north toward Montana, even the occasional cavalry patrol cutting across the valley road, but this was different. The dust did not form a loose drifting trail like travelers usually left behind. It formed a wide moving wall, stretching farther than a single herd could spread, and the longer Elias watched the clearer it became that the riders were not wandering across the prairie. They were moving in one direction, toward him. Inside the farmhouse the floorboards creaked softly, and Elias heard small footsteps approach the door. When he turned his head, he saw the boy standing in the doorway wrapped in the oversized cotton shirt that hung almost to his knees, dark hair falling across tired eyes that had already seen more miles than most children ever should. The boy followed Elias's gaze toward the distant ridge, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then the child's shoulders stiffened slightly, as if a truth he had been carrying all night had finally reached him as well. Taza stepped out onto the porch beside the old farmer, his bare feet silent against the wood, and he looked across the prairie with a quiet seriousness that made him seem older than his years. Elias did not ask what the boy saw because the answer had already begun to reveal itself across the brightening hills. Small shapes appeared along the ridge, first a few dark specks cutting through the rising dust, then more behind them, spreading slowly across the skyline like shadows moving through morning light. Horses. Many horses. The wind shifted again, and the distant thunder of hooves grew louder, rolling across the open land until even the horses in Elias's barn lifted their heads uneasily. The riders began descending from the ridge in long, steady lines, their silhouettes sharp against the pale sky, and the sight carried a quiet weight that settled deep in Elias Whitaker's chest. He had spent 12 years building a life that asked nothing from the world beyond his fields and his fences, yet the world had found him anyway. The boy beside him whispered something softly in a language Elias did not understand, but the meaning did not require translation. The riders were not wandering. They were searching. And by the time the first line of horses reached the lower hills, Elias Whitaker understood that the quiet night he had spent tending a wounded child had just drawn the attention of far more people than a lonely farmer on the Wyoming plains was ever meant to face. The riders continued descending from the ridge in long, steady lines until the prairie seemed to move with them, the sunlight flashing against hundreds of shifting shapes as horses carried their riders across the dry Wyoming grass toward the lonely farmhouse that had stood undisturbed for 12 quiet years. Elias Whitaker did not move from the yard where he stood beside the porch, his weathered hands resting calmly at his sides while his eyes followed the slow approach across nearly half a mile of open land. The sound reached them clearly now, the steady drumming of hooves traveling through the earth like distant thunder that refused to fade. Taza remained beside him, silent and still, watching the riders with a focus that made the boy appear far older than the child Elias had carried into the house only hours earlier. The wind lifted the loose hem of the oversized cotton shirt Elias had given him, and the boy squinted against the bright morning sun as the first line of riders reached the lower slope beyond the fields. From this distance Elias could see their formation more clearly. They did not scatter across the prairie like travelers searching for water or a trail. They moved in careful order, spreading wide across the horizon, but always keeping their direction fixed toward the farmhouse and its surrounding fence line. The old farmer slowly exhaled and turned his head toward the barn where his two horses shifted uneasily inside their stalls, as if even they understood that the quiet rhythm of this land had just changed. Elias had lived long enough on the frontier to know that moments like this rarely offered a second chance to choose what kind of man you wanted to be. He glanced down at the boy and noticed something that had escaped him during the long night. Around Taza's neck hung a thin leather cord holding a small carved pendant shaped like a hawk feather, its surface worn smooth from years of careful touch. The boy held it gently in one hand now as he watched the approaching riders, his expression steady but thoughtful, as though he had been expecting this moment long before he collapsed beside the fence. Elias nodded slowly to himself, not asking questions the boy might not be ready to answer. The riders reached the edge of the lower field and began to slow their pace, horses stepping carefully through the tall grass as the line widened across nearly the entire length of Elias Whitaker's land. Dust drifted around them in golden clouds under the morning sun, and for a long moment the only sound was the wind moving softly across the prairie. Then the first rider moved ahead of the others. He rode a tall gray horse and wore a long dark coat that hung straight across the saddle, as if even the wind respected the stillness of the man who sat there. His posture carried a quiet authority that did not require raised voices or sudden movements. The rider approached slowly until he was no more than 30 yards from the farmhouse gate, where he stopped and lifted one hand gently. Behind him the rest of the riders came to a halt in perfect silence, hundreds of horses settling into stillness as if the land itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Elias Whitaker stepped forward across the yard until he reached the old wooden gate that marked the boundary of his fields. The wood creaked softly as he rested his arm across the top rail. For a few long seconds neither man spoke. The prairie wind moved between them, carrying the scent of dust and sun-warmed grass. Then Taza took one careful step forward beside Elias, and when the boy lifted his head the rider on the gray horse leaned slightly in the saddle as recognition spread across his face like sunlight breaking through clouds. In that quiet moment Elias Whitaker realized something important. The riders had not come to conquer his land. They had come for the boy standing beside him. The man on the gray horse studied the boy carefully for a long, quiet moment, the morning sun reflecting softly along the polished leather of his saddle while the prairie wind tugged at the edges of his dark coat. The riders behind him remained completely still, hundreds of horses standing in patient silence across the open field, as if they had practiced this moment many times before. Taza stepped forward slowly until he stood beside the gate next to Elias Whitaker, the small hawk feather pendant resting against his chest as he lifted his eyes toward the rider. For a few seconds the two simply looked at each other across the 30 yards of dry grass, and Elias could feel the weight of that silent exchange even though he did not yet understand it. Then the boy raised his hand and spoke a few calm words in his own language, his voice steady despite the enormous gathering of riders stretching across the prairie behind the man on the gray horse. Something changed in the rider's face when he heard the boy speak. The tight line of concern across his brow eased slightly, and he lowered his head in a slow, respectful nod that carried the quiet authority of someone who did not need to raise his voice to be understood. The rider placed one hand over his chest and replied in the same language, his voice deep and measured, carrying easily through the still morning air. Elias did not understand the words, but he recognized the tone. It was not anger. It was relief. The boy glanced briefly toward Elias, as if remembering that the old farmer stood beside him. Then he spoke again to the rider and pointed gently back toward the farmhouse behind them. The rider listened carefully, and when the boy finished he turned his head slightly toward the long line of riders behind him. A small gesture of his hand passed through the ranks like a quiet ripple across water. Horses shifted, but none moved forward, as though the entire gathering understood that whatever happened next would be decided here at the gate. The man on the gray horse then guided his mount a few careful steps closer until he stood just beyond the wooden rail. Up close, Elias could see that the rider's hair had begun to turn silver at the temples, and the calm steadiness in his eyes carried the kind of patience that only years of leadership could teach. The rider looked first at the boy and then at Elias Whitaker, studying the old farmer's weathered face, the worn work shirt, the dirt still clinging to the cuffs of his boots from the early morning chores that had started like any other day. For a moment the rider seemed to weigh something silently, as if measuring a man not by his words but by the quiet evidence of his life. Then he slowly swung one leg across the saddle and stepped down from the gray horse. The sound of his boots touching the ground carried clearly through the still air, and the movement caused a faint stir among the distant riders, though none of them advanced. The man approached the gate with slow, respectful steps until he stood a few feet from Elias and the boy. He placed his hand gently on Taza's shoulder, looking down at him with an expression that revealed something deeper than simple recognition. Pride. Taza spoke again, explaining something in a calm voice while occasionally gesturing toward the farmhouse and then toward Elias. The man listened without interrupting. When the boy finished, the rider lifted his gaze toward the old farmer once more. For a few seconds the two men simply regarded each other across the wooden rail. Then the rider placed his hand over his chest again and spoke slowly in clear, careful English that carried the quiet strength of a promise. He said that the boy's name was Taza, and that he was the son of Chief Nantan Luda. Chief Nantan Luda's words settled gently in the morning air, but the meaning behind them carried a quiet weight that Elias Whitaker felt deep in his chest. The old farmer looked down at the boy beside him, and for the first time truly understood why the riders had crossed miles of prairie before the sun had even climbed halfway into the sky. Taza was not simply a lost child. He was the son of the man who now stood at the gate. Elias nodded slowly, his weathered face calm though the sight of hundreds of riders stretched across his fields might have shaken a younger man. The chief studied him carefully, as though searching for the answer to a question that had traveled across the plains with him through the night. Then Taza spoke again, his voice quiet but steady, explaining to his father what had happened after darkness fell. He described the farmhouse, the warm fire, the bowl of broth Elias had prepared, and the way the old farmer had sat beside the bed through the long hours while the prairie wind rattled the windows. The chief listened without interrupting, his eyes occasionally lifting toward Elias with a look that grew more thoughtful with every word. When the boy finished speaking, the man remained silent for several seconds, his gaze drifting briefly across the wide fields surrounding the farmhouse. Corn rows stretched toward the distant hills, and the long wooden fences stood straight and carefully repaired, signs of a life built through patience rather than pride. The chief then turned back toward Elias and spoke again in measured English. He explained that his people had searched through the night, because Taza had not returned to their camp. The boy had been riding ahead of the others during a long journey across the valley and had become separated from them after sunset. When the chief discovered his son was missing, every rider had joined the search. They followed the faint tracks across miles of prairie until the trail ended at the fence of Elias Whitaker's land. Elias listened quietly, resting both arms across the gate rail while the chief spoke. The old farmer had spent enough years on the frontier to understand what that kind of search must have meant. 500 riders crossing the plains before dawn was not the movement of a war party. It was the movement of a father who refused to lose his son. The chief paused then and looked once more at Taza, placing his hand gently on the boy's shoulder, as though reassuring himself that the child truly stood there unharmed beneath the bright Wyoming sun. A faint smile touched the corners of his eyes before he spoke again. He said that Taza had told him how the old farmer had found him near the fence line and had carried him inside when the night wind grew cold. The chief's voice remained calm and steady, but something deeper moved beneath the words. Gratitude. Elias shifted slightly, uncomfortable with attention he had never asked for, and shrugged his shoulders in a quiet gesture that suggested the matter had been simple enough. A boy needed help. The rest followed naturally. The chief seemed to understand this without explanation. He nodded once more and stepped back toward his horse, but before mounting he turned again toward Elias Whitaker. The prairie wind moved softly between them, carrying the scent of warm grass and dust as hundreds of riders watched in silence from the fields. The chief raised his hand slowly and spoke with a voice that carried clearly across the open land. He said that kindness given in the night should never be forgotten in the morning. The chief's words drifted across the open prairie like the first calm breeze after a long storm, and for several quiet seconds no one moved. Elias Whitaker stood with his arms resting on the wooden gate, while the morning sun warmed the dry fields behind him, unsure what a man was supposed to say when 500 riders had crossed the plains simply because he had helped a child through a cold night. The chief placed one foot in the stirrup of his gray horse, but paused before mounting, turning once more toward the old farmer with a thoughtful expression that suggested the moment was not yet finished. Taza remained beside Elias, holding the small hawk feather pendant in one hand while he watched his father carefully, as if he already knew that something important was about to happen. The wind rolled gently across the prairie grass, carrying the quiet sound of hundreds of horses shifting their weight while the riders waited without impatience. Chief Nantan Luda rested his hand on the saddle and spoke again, his voice calm but strong enough to reach across the yard. He said that the land remembered the actions of those who lived upon it, and that kindness offered freely was a seed that could grow long after the moment had passed. Elias shifted his weight slightly, uncomfortable with words that sounded too large for the simple act he had done the night before. He rubbed the back of his neck and glanced out across the wide fields that had been his whole world for so many years, fields he had planted alone every spring and walked alone every autumn when the harvest ended. To him the choice had never felt like anything remarkable. A boy had needed shelter from the cold. That was all there was to it. The chief seemed to read that thought in the old farmer's face because a faint smile touched his expression before he lifted his hand once more. The riders behind him responded to the signal immediately, though not with noise or sudden movement. Instead, the long line of horsemen slowly guided their mounts forward until the entire gathering advanced several yards across the field in quiet unison. The sight carried a quiet power that made the open land feel suddenly smaller. Horses stopped again as the chief lowered his hand, and the riders settled once more into stillness as if the entire assembly moved according to a single steady heartbeat. Elias looked out across the gathering and felt something he had not expected. It was not fear. It was the realization that these people had come not as strangers, but as witnesses to a moment that mattered more to them than he had ever imagined. The chief finally swung into the saddle and turned his horse slightly so that he faced both Elias and the long line of riders behind him. He spoke again, this time in his own language, his voice carrying clearly across the prairie. Though Elias did not understand the words, the meaning soon became clear through the actions that followed. One by one the riders began lowering their heads in quiet respect, a gesture that moved through the gathering like a slow wave across the grasslands. Hundreds of riders remained seated on their horses, heads bowed beneath the bright Wyoming sky, honoring the simple kindness of a man who had expected nothing in return. Taza looked up at Elias with a small proud smile, as if the boy understood that the quiet life of a lonely farmer had just become something far greater than Elias Whitaker had ever intended. For a long moment the prairie remained completely still, as if the land itself had paused to watch the quiet gesture ripple across the gathering of riders. Elias Whitaker stood beside the wooden gate with the morning sun warming his shoulders while hundreds of bowed heads faced the ground in silent respect. The old farmer had spent most of his life believing that the world rarely noticed small acts, that kindness often passed through the wind like dust across the plains, unseen and quickly forgotten. Yet the sight before him suggested something very different. Taza remained close at his side, the small hawk feather pendant resting against his chest as he watched the riders slowly raise their heads again. The boy's eyes carried a quiet pride that Elias had not seen the night before when exhaustion and cold had weighed heavily on him. Chief Nantan Luda guided his gray horse a few steps forward once more until he stood again near the gate. The horse moved calmly beneath him, ears flicking gently toward the farmhouse and the open fields beyond. The chief studied Elias with the same thoughtful expression he had shown since arriving, as though he understood that the old farmer was still trying to make sense of the moment unfolding across his land. Then the chief reached into the small leather pouch hanging from his saddle and removed a simple object wrapped carefully in a piece of dark cloth. He leaned forward slightly and extended the bundle across the wooden rail toward Elias. The old farmer hesitated at first, his rough hands resting on the weathered wood as he looked at the offering. He had never been a man who expected gifts, and the quiet life he had built on the prairie had never required more than steady work and patience with the land. But the chief waited calmly, his arms still extended, and after a moment Elias accepted the bundle with slow, respectful hands. The cloth unfolded to reveal a small carved token made from smooth bone, shaped in the form of a hawk with wings stretched wide, as if gliding across the sky. The carving was simple but precise, the lines worn slightly from years of careful handling. Elias turned it gently in his palm, while the chief spoke again in calm, deliberate English. He explained that among his people the hawk was a watcher of the plains, a guardian who saw danger before it reached the village and who guided the lost back toward safety. The token, he said, had belonged to his father before him and to his father's father before that. Taza watched quietly as the chief spoke, then stepped forward and placed his hand briefly against the carving in Elias's palm, nodding as if confirming that the gift had found the place it was meant to go. Elias looked up from the small hawk and met the chief's steady gaze across the gate. The chief explained that from this day forward the riders of his people would remember the farmhouse that stood on this patch of prairie and the man who had opened his door when the night wind was cold. Any traveler who carried the hawk token, he said, would know that Elias Whitaker was a friend of their tribe and that his land would always be respected. The chief then drew a slow breath and turned his horse slightly toward the long line of riders waiting in the fields. The sun had climbed higher now, casting bright light across the wide Wyoming plains while the wind carried the faint scent of dry grass and distant mountains. For the first time in many years Elias Whitaker felt something stir in the quiet space of his life that had once belonged to loneliness. It was the feeling that the prairie had just woven his story into something much larger than a single farm or a single night of kindness. The prairie wind moved softly across the fields as Elias Whitaker stood at the gate, holding the small hawk carving in his rough hands, the smooth bone warm now from the morning sun. For a long moment, he simply looked at it, turning the token slowly between his fingers while the meaning of everything that had happened began to settle into the quiet corners of his mind. The chief guided his gray horse back a few steps and raised his hand once more toward the waiting riders. This time the gesture carried a different meaning. Horses shifted gently across the prairie as the long line of riders began to turn, one by one, their movements calm and unhurried, as if the purpose of their journey had already been fulfilled. The gathering that had filled the fields only minutes before slowly began to dissolve across the wide Wyoming plains, riders guiding their horses back toward the distant hills where the morning sun now painted the grasslands gold. Taza lingered for a moment beside Elias at the gate, looking up at the old farmer with an expression that carried more gratitude than words could easily hold. The boy placed his small hand briefly over his heart and then touched the hawk pendant hanging from his neck before stepping back toward his father's horse. Chief Nantan Luda leaned down from the saddle and lifted his son easily into place behind him. For a moment the two of them sat there in silence while the rest of the riders continued to drift away across the prairie like a quiet river of moving shadows. The chief turned his horse slightly so that he faced Elias Whitaker one last time. The wind moved gently through the tall grass between them, and the chief spoke again in the calm, steady voice that had carried across the fields all morning. He said that a man does not always see the full path of his kindness, but the land remembers, and so do the people who walk upon it. Elias nodded, once in quiet understanding. He was not a man of many speeches and never had been. The chief studied him for another moment, and then gave a final respectful tilt of his head before guiding the gray horse toward the departing riders. Within minutes the prairie began to return to the same quiet stillness that had filled it at sunrise. The distant line of riders moved steadily toward the hills until the dust they carried faded slowly into the bright sky. Elias Whitaker remained at the gate long after the last horse disappeared beyond the ridge. The fields stretched wide and empty again, just as they had the day before, yet something about the land felt different now. He looked down once more at the small hawk carving resting in his palm, and allowed himself a quiet smile that had not visited his face in many years. Then he turned back toward the farmhouse where the kettle still waited on the stove, and the morning chores had yet to be finished. The work of the day would continue just as it always had. But now the old farmer knew that somewhere beyond the distant hills there were riders who would remember the night when a lonely house left its door open against the cold. And sometimes, when the autumn wind rolled down from the mountains, Elias Whitaker would glance toward the horizon and imagine that the prairie itself was carrying a quiet message back and forth across the land, reminding anyone who listened that even the smallest kindness can travel farther than a man ever expects.